Welcome, everyone. My name is Judd Hendricks, and I want to welcome you to a special program that we're doing through Cultivating a Soul-Centric City called Developing a Soulful Image of Your Child through Loving Observation. This is a program that Joppa Buckner, who is facilitating the process, is leading. And it came out of some conversation around how do we tend to the soul of our children. One of the challenges that we're aware of in creating a soul-centric city is the pressure from our own projections onto our children about who we think they ought to be or who we want them to be, and also pressures from our culture to help mold and shape children in specific ways that may not be the natural way they show up in the world. So the ultimate goal of our time is to be able to learn how to observe, behold, love, and nurture who our children naturally are. And Joppa began this conversation last week, and we'll continue the learning about this process of loving observation and how we can do that. So I want to welcome you all. Welcome those that are joining us by Zoom and those that are joining on Facebook. If you have a question or a comment, feel free to put that either in the chat box in our time together, or you can put that in the comment section on Facebook Live, and we'll try to bring that conversation in today. Once we move into some real particular working with specific people, we are going to go offline, and we'll stop recording that to give folks that are on Zoom an opportunity to share some more reflections about their children and that process. But we did want to record this part, so if you're following Joppa, you can also know the process and where we are in that process, and be able to do it with your own children. So I want to welcome Joppa Buckner. We introduced Joppa a little bit more last week. Joppa is trained as a Waldorf teacher and has worked with a variety of ages, and just has a vast knowledge of kind of Waldorf education, but also kind of a spiritual way in which he engages children and just people in general. And so I've found this process that we're learning not only helpful for looking at my own children who are adult children, but also just a way of observing people, trying to be present to people. Feels like some of our work is how do we create a culture where we can help everybody be uniquely themselves. And so some of these things that we're learning, Joppa, I'm applying to just the way in which I engage people. So I'm finding this very applicable, not only for my children, but for how I want to be in the world. So Joppa, I'm going to turn it over to you if you want to give a little more introduction about maybe what we talked about briefly last week and where we are this week. Thank you so much for your wisdom and being with us today. You're still on mute there, Joppa.
Thank you, Judd, and welcome, Kathy, Tanya, and Matt, and all those who may be on Facebook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually pull up a slide, and I will do a brief review of what we talked about last week, and then I will go on. Last week, as Judd mentioned, we worked on the idea of what does it mean to have a loving and careful observations of the children? What does that look like? And I'm going to go and review that briefly. And then we're going to go on to how do we cultivate a feeling perception from those observations and lift out imagery that can help us perceive what may be significant in those observations to help us be more authentically in relationship with our children. So I'm going to go ahead and share. It's always difficult to find my. So this is it. Okay, let me see. I don't think, are you all seeing my screen? Probably not. think I got it wrong here.
Yes. Yeah, we see your screen.
You see the loving, careful observation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so in this slide, you'll see what the loving approach looks like. And this was important. It says a child's presence is not an accident of heredity. A child's presence reflects the activity of spirit at creating a person prepared to fulfill a destiny. So initially in observing our own children, that's an important principle to begin with, that what we do see does reflect the work of the child's spirit in creating a being that is capable of fulfilling a destiny. And in terms of what it means to take a careful approach, beyond the features identifying a child's gender, ethnicity, or race, seek in your descriptions nuance that reveals individuality. Such individuality will stimulate revealing imagery. So those are the two principles of what we make it say loving and careful observation of our children. And we went through a form last week that gave us a lot of details on how to do observations of that type. What we didn't do last week was cover the children's drawings. Children's drawings are very important in these observations in terms of seeing how the sensory motor integration is reflected in the cognitive maturation of the children. So I'm gonna go a little bit through a synopsis I did of a book by a woman named Dr. Michaela Glockler called Children's Drawings, which is a good book that if you wanna learn more about observing children's drawings to get. Now, I'm gonna try to switch to this screen. Let me know if you all end up getting it.
Yes.
And then you see the screen that says about children's drawings?
We do. We see
Okay.
discerning phases of physical development and self-imaging.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So I'm gonna go talk about what to look like from basically quickly from about the age of 2 to about the 5th grade in children's drawings. Initially, if you're watching the children's drawings earlier, they do what we might call these sort of arcing scribbles, which you might see down here. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but in the lower left-hand side at the bottom, you see these black arcing scribbles. And that's usually what you will see when children start off at around the age of between the toddlers and 2s. And what's the goal of these scribblings will be to go from spirals to eventually to making a closed circle and to crossing lines. And these will, between the age of 2 and 3, you can usually expect to see this progress from these scribbles to a closed circle, closed circles to crossing lines. And then you may see children begin to image themselves and draw what is called the tree person, which is a person who basically demonstrates those capacities to close a circle and to draw the crossing lines. So by the age of 3, children will, on average, be able to draw these tree people. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, my children at the age of 3 couldn't draw those tree people. And I have noticed, even though these drawings were depicted in the book by Michaela Glockler, I have noticed that children aren't quite demonstrating these tree persons at the age of 3, but they are closing the circle and they are crossing lines. It's an important observation to make. Now, something really interesting happens for the 4-year-old. The 4-year-old, we can say, becomes awake in their senses. And so they become very aware of seeing, smelling, touching. And actually they start drawing aliens, what I call aliens. These people with large heads, eyes and mouths and antennas and limbs. And you'll see these alien or sense drawings, where the children are very much focusing and demonstrating to you that they are awake in their senses. And so between the age of 4 and 5, you should expect the children to be depicting themselves with these large heads, with these eyes, with these limbs coming out of the heads, what we call more of a twofold than a threefold person. There's usually not much of a trunk. There's usually head and limbs. And then at the age of 5, you get what we would call, the children begin to represent what's in their environment. And sometimes it's not quite recognizable by you, but they will tell you, this is a flower, this is a tree, and then they will be making this attempt to draw what we call representative pictures between the ages of 5 and 6. And then after the age of 6, we start getting the house person tree drawing, which is a very important drawing for to show that children are ready for academic readiness. In the Waldorf School, we don't begin any academic work until the children are first grade ready. And one of the things for first grade readiness is to see these house person tree drawings. And what you look for in those drawings, the human being is threefold, means there's a clearly defined head, torso, and limbs. The trees and the houses are on the ground, because a lot of times children will not be, even if they're 6 or 7, will not be drawing the houses and trees on the ground. You see these archetypal houses, and it's almost no matter where you are, you see the archetypal block house with a roof. Eventually, the limbs will begin to spread out on those trees. There will be windows in the houses, and there may even be a chimney, and you get a clear house person tree drawing with the people and the houses on the ground. Now, another important thing to note here, in these pictures, the sun has been depicted as being on the right side. Well, generally, that's not the case. Generally, the sun, you can watch it from a 6-year-old or a first grade ready child, that sun will go from the left side to the right side. By the time they're in the 2nd grade, it's a very interesting process to watch. And if the sun is in the right side, then you will note that the child is probably precocious. But that usually they're still in a dreamy place and the sun is on the left side, and that sun will actually, you can just watch it move across the page in the 1st grade. It's been such an interesting experience to watch how normal that is for most children. Now, I don't have the remaining pictures, but once the children get in the 1st grade, most of their images will be on one horizon line, and the children will be facing out of the picture. In a way, it's a good image of their consciousness. They're sort of just stuck there, facing out, and they can't step into the 3rd dimension, but they can't move laterally either. It's kind of like their consciousness in the 1st grade before they're really ready to take on the academic work. And then what happens in the 1st grade, as you move to the 2nd grade, they begin to draw themselves in profile. And now they can move along the horizon line. And that mobility would be reflected in the cognitive capacity of the children also. By the time they get to the 3rd grade, they will be able to have more than one horizon line. You'll see the children, but they will be on one or the other, but the children will have a background in their picture and a foreground. In the 4th grade, the children will normally be able to step off that horizon line. Now, a good thing to look for the 4th grader is whether or not you have a bird's eye view. Sometimes children would draw themselves starting in the 4th grade in a bird's eye view, which means all the people would be little and like they're looking down on themselves. And actually, there's some reasons you want to encourage them a little bit away from that. I won't talk too much about it, but you will note that in the 4th grade, that capacity, but it's not always a good thing. Some children in drawing from a bird's eye view are a little bit out of their own picture, and that can create some difficulties. And so that's the progress you can see in drawings, and it's very important to take a look at those children's drawings to get a sense of how sensory integration is coming along and whether or not that's reflected in cognitive maturation in the drawings. Okay, any questions about that before I go on?
Just that is fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is fascinating.
Okay, so
yeah, it'd be interesting to also look at that as adults. I mean, I feel like some of those pictures are more advanced artistically than mine. I'm like, I wonder if I put the sun in the left. I probably would. I don't know what that means, but now I'm wondering. Anyway, thanks for, that's really interesting. Thanks for that research too.
And one value of this process that I have used is that a lot of times when you have children who really have difficulty with executive functioning, which means, impulse control and flexible thinking and working memory, a lot of times, and so they may have some behavioral issues. A lot of times, depending on what age they're at and what's the nature of the difficulties, something that you do what you call planning. You plan for the crises by having the children do guided drawings of how they're going to respond. And this how they depict themselves, or how you guide them to depict themselves in the picturing, can be very important in executive functioning. I have actually a little slideshow on that I can give people a link to about how to use drawings to work with developing executive functioning in children. So I just got this little thing I want to say before we go on. Because we're moving into the area of imaging. Active images arise from our feeling in response to the observations made of the child. And then I give this little analogy with Yoruba people. The Yoruba people understand that keeping present our memories of our ancestors nurtured the persistence of our feelings for our ancestors. When these feelings fade, consciousness of our ancestors is lost in what they call zamani, the forgotten past. There is opportunity in when our feelings persist, there is opportunity in the immediate future, what they call swaza, for our ancestors to join us in our work with the gods, guiding our hands, hearts, and minds. What this means is that when this is a way in ancestor worship, one thing we're trying to do is keep our memories authentic of our ancestors. And by having those authentic memories, we stay in relationship. And a similar process is important for our children. In a like manner, we must keep present the content of our observations of the child, or our feelings for our healthy relating with them may be lost. So one thing we're going to talk about how to use a breathing process to stay present with the observations we make of the children and how this becomes a feeling perception. So first I want to talk about basically when we start having these images, they will be of four kinds usually. We will have images from the mineral kingdom, which are like, earth, fire, water, air, things that represent the mineral kingdom in our descriptions. There will be images out of the plant kingdom, and there'll be images out of the animal kingdom, and also the archetypes of the human kingdoms. There also could be some divine archetypes in there also, but we would generally we're going to be dealing mostly with for younger children in these four kingdoms, and we will learn how to look at whether or not these are included or not included in our imaging to give us a sense of what is being presented to us about the child in the imaging process. But what is most important is first to cultivate a feeling perception based on our observations. I'm going to read this little part down here in the blue right now. And it says, the feeling perception is an impression the observations of the child leaves in the physical and emotional response. This is like unto the perception of moods and attitudes in words. So like when we hear words, we also can perceive moods and attitudes, not just the meaning of the words. And so what we're saying is that there's something that's going to be behind these observations that will impact our physical and emotional response. There will be a perception of something about where the child is, just like we perceive moods and attitudes when we listen to words. And when the words are emptied from memory, the perceived moods and attitudes will persist. So I'm gonna stop again. So that's kind of a lot there. Are there any questions or comments about either using the 4 elements, recognizing the 4 elements as the content of our images, or this ideal that the feeling perception is somewhat that we're trying to cultivate is somewhat like what happens when we're listening to someone speak and perceive something behind the words that indicates a more subtle aspect of what they're bringing toward us. Any comments?
I had a comment. So this would, where my mind went, this would also apply to if the words that they're using are some sort of a trigger points or some sort of, misconceptualized concepts by us as an adults, we would then misunderstand what the child is saying based on a personal filter of the word, or the meaning thereof, what it means to us, right? So hearing those words, like I almost see it as hearing those words, you almost have to, that breathing would almost include us turning off our personal filter for the words.
Right. And I'm not saying only just that we're going to be, I'm using the words as an example, but what we are talking about are all the observations we've made of the child conveying similar things to moods and attitudes to us, but like in the way that we pick that up when we're hearing words. And what we're going to be doing in the breathing process, as you pointed out, is true. We're going to be trying to turn off our personal filters so that what we hear is more reflective of what is being given to us by those observations. So that we have a feeling perception that is in some way authentic is what we're going to be moving toward. And the way we're going to do this is related to a practice to achieve feeling perception. One initiates a hierarchy of association in the manner of the contemplative practice of pratyahara. Pratyahara is one of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. Now, first, there is this pulsative association, which means it's like a mantra, which means I take whatever the 2 aspects are, in this case, the observation and our physical response, and I'll use the breathing to bring those in association as in a pulsative way, with an in-breath and an out-breath. I will associate these 2 things, and that's considered a pulsative association. And then you use the breathing to do what is called an incantative association, where the 2 things begin to be identified together. So in this case, we will show that you breathe in both together and start holding them on the in-breath together, the 2 things. And then as you breathe out, you will let the observations, you will have the imagery of them dissolving into one another. And that's called ideative association, where the 2 things have the same meaning together. So this process I'm going to talk about comes from this practice of pratyahara, where you have this pulsative association, which flows into an incantative association to what is an ideative or identifying association, the 2 things identified. And so I'm gonna go through this. We're not necessarily gonna practice it right now, but I'm just gonna show you how the practice proceeds. And like I said, some of Kathy and Tanya have done these observations. We'll get to those. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But as you breathe in, you would recall your observations of the child. See the child with your mind's eye as vividly as you can. And having done the observations that will make this eidetic process a little easier. As you breathe out, allow awareness of the physical and emotional response to the observation in the child to feel your awareness. So then you have this pulsive association. And you would work with that for a little while until that feels comfortable, where you can breathe in the image and breathe out the physical and emotional response. So those two things become associated. Pause briefly. Well, once you have worked with that a little while, then you would breathe in, attending to both at the same time. And as you would breathe out, you would imagine that the imagery, the observations sort of dissolve into your physical and emotional response, so that you're only left with this feeling perception. And that's what you want to be left with, a feeling perception which is unique to the observations you've made. And we'll find out later about how we lift images out of that. Again, I will stop briefly because I know this is a little thick, but you all can all go back to these slides. But there are any responses to just that first part? Okay, so the second part of this process is, once you have done the first part, as you breathe in, allow that feeling perception, which now you have developed when you let the one dissolve into the other so that they became identified with one another. That's the feeling perception, which I'm calling here a synergy. You breathe in, allow the synergy of the child image and your physical and emotional responses to feel your awareness. As you breathe out, allow your awareness to empty. And this is important because one thing that Rudolf Steiner talks about is that true images, it's like you have a dream. And when you wake up from a dream in the morning, you kind of forget the dream a little bit, and then you remember what it means. There's this forgetfulness which is necessary so that the real intuition can come in. So this feeling perception has to be let go on the out breath. And then you just kind of wait to see what imagery comes in its place. And you can gently call to mind one of the archetypes or the archetypes. So think about the mineral kingdom, think about the plant kingdom, just kind of generally let your mind scan over those kingdoms as you're doing the out breath, but empty yourself a little bit of the feeling perception and see what comes in. And so this is the process of cultivating feeling perception and allowing the feeling perception then to be replaced with imagery.
Japa, can I just kind of, when you say feeling perception, is that like, is that the same as an emotional response, or is that, because feeling and emotion sometimes are different?
It's the next level up. So what happens, you have a physical and emotional responses, sort of a gestalt of physical and emotional responses. Now it begins, it's a unique quality that you begin to experience, an impression in that emotional response that is reflective of the observation you made of your child. So perception is a crucial word. So it's when you feel that you're perceiving something in the physical and emotional response. Do people follow what distinction I'm making? It's like sometimes I'll kind of feel like, oh, I know what something means. I'll have that feeling perception that's behind my emotions and physical responses. And that's where you're going to. You initially will have an emotional and physical response, but it may not be perceptive. And so what you're working with here is to move to a more, is a sense of a quality of that connects you, makes you feel an aha in your relationship with your child. But it's not to a cognitive place where you can't articulate it necessarily, but this, like you might say, like all of you, I might say, I know who my child is. Each of you have a person in your child. When you leave, you know who your child is. That's your feeling perception of your child. You know, it's unique to just your emotional response. It's a perception and almost identification of a certain feeling perception. Like if you sometimes someone will ask you a question and you'll think you know the answer to the question, and it'll be like you'll look up and you'll think, oh yeah, wait a moment, I think I know what that is. You've had a Gestalt experience where in the moment, physically, you feel you know the answer, but it isn't articulated yet. There's a feeling perception, which is a little bit different than just the emotional and physical response, because you think it points to something. And so that's where you're trying to get to with feeling perception. That's why you have to initially do those first processes to move beyond just having observations and physical responses, but to have those things sort of become together, create a synergy of those things, which creates a unique identification of those.
Yeah, and can you parse or where is this sense of intuition? Was that a word you would use as well as?
Like I said earlier, it's like I hear the words when someone is speaking to me, but I also can perceive the mood and the attitude behind it. So that's the feeling perception. When I feel more, when I do more than just observe the sounds and even just the meaning of the sounds, but I know the person is communicating to me an attitude or a mood. That's the feeling perception. And there's a similar experience you can have out of the observations you make of the child. And so then you want to take that feeling perception. Behind that feeling perception is, in terms of observations, is a real knowledge about balance and imbalance. Just like if I hear the mood or attitude, that tells me some information about that person overall. Same thing in these observations. There's some information behind this feeling perception in terms of what does it indicate? And we'll get into more of that next week when we talk about how to find the significances in these imageries. But there's something behind that indicates something about the state of the child that we're trying to get to. Mm-hmm. But we want to first have the capacity. And once you get the feeling perception, you don't have to even go to the next thing, because in a way this is like the Yoruba thing. Now I'm more authentically in relationship with the, it's just like if I'm working with another human being, I'm sitting there listening to another human being. Say, for instance, I have no capacity to perceive mood or attitude. How am I going to engage with that person? I can hear the words, know the meaning of them, but I can't perceive mood or attitude. So in the same way, if you don't move to a feeling perception with your child, in a way, and all of you all, everybody to a certain degree has it, we want to be able to use that to even get in a deeper relationship with the child. But the ideal is that you begin to have this picture now of really about the child that can inform you even more deeply about what may be going on with the child. But now you're in a stronger relationship no matter what. Just like I'm in a better relationship with someone, I can experience their mood and attitude. If I can get to a feeling perception with another person or with a young child, then I'm deep, my relationship is already better. Even if I don't want to articulate that, even if I don't go to the place of ferreting out all an understanding of what I see, I'm already have done something valuable. Mm-hmm. So I like to really make a point of that. This first two stages in the process can be really beneficial in themselves. Yeah. The next process, in a way, is kind of the icing on the cake, because you can then begin to get a sense of, how the child may be experiencing imbalances in their own being, that you may be able to look at, bring something to, in terms of art, we talk about, in Waldorf, we talk about the two tools we have are what we call time arts and space arts as teachers, because we're not psychologists. So we have two curriculum tools, and that is therapeutically, we have what we call the time arts, which is poetry and movement and all of that. And we also have the drawing arts and the sculpting arts. Those are the two things that we can bring into the children's lives in a conscious way, attentive to how it may affect them, that can lead to shifts. Let's go. We're not psychologists. This is not a process toward some kind of, understanding beyond the scope of teachers or parents. It doesn't mean that you might not get an indication that maybe you want to seek out some more therapeutic intervention, but you just got to be careful. As a teacher, I have to be careful. Parents, you don't have to be careful, but I had to be careful always to stay within my lane when I do this work.
In response to some of the parsing of this language of feeling perception, Julie put in the chat box, she said a kind of like emotional wisdom or intelligence. So
yes.
Emotional wisdom or intelligence.
Right. Because it's more than just an emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
You feel that intelligence in the emotional response. You say, oh, and that's there. It hasn't been articulated necessarily, but you can identify it as holding something, as holding knowledge. And unfortunately, this is one of my big things is that we in our society we miss this resource so much in all kind of arenas that we just let that flow away. We have these periods of feeling perception, and we don't stay with them enough to find out how they can inform our decision making and things we do in relationships. So it's one of my big things is to promote this a little bit more.
Japa, before we get into the practice and having the folks on Zoom kind of work with this, can you go back to that slide and show us those 4 steps again?
Yeah.
So there was a breathing process that I want to make sure people are clear with and comfortable with.
Okay, so what we have here, like I said, first we do this positive thing. So on the in-breath, we're holding the observations. And on the out-breath, we're trying to sink into our physical and emotional responses. And so that's the positive association that we first start with. In-breath, bring back to memory whatever my observations were. And for the people who were here last week, you can do this on a particular set of observations. You can do it on like the facial observations you made only, or you can do it on the movement element. And so you breathe in, eidetically bring yourself back to those observations, an image of the child. You breathe out and try to sink into your physical emotional response. And it may take a little work with that before you really feel you have that positive association. And once you have that positive association, then you want to do what is called in mantra meditation, move to the incantative, which means that one leads to the other. So if I see the observations, I have the emotional response. So those things come together. So if I think of the observation, then the emotional response appears for me. So they're together now. So I breathe in and I have that association, incantative. And then when I breathe out, I sort of let things empty. I let one dissolve into the other. I try to go to an ideative association, which means they are the same. There isn't any distinction between the observations and my perception. And so when you get to that point, you actually have a feeling perception. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to do this to get a feeling perception. That could come to you right away. But this is a process that I actually myself sometimes when I go and observe a child in a classroom and I don't spend much time with the child, teacher says, we have a child who's having difficulty, can you come and observe? So I go and observe for like 2 hours. Then I leave. Well, that's not necessarily deep enough. And then I find this process with pratyahara or this, will bring me to a deeper experience in feeling perception. It's worked pretty consistently for me based on the practice of pratyahara.
Good, thank you. Does anybody else have any? I think this will become more clear to us as we actually do it.
Right. The thing is that, let me see, where should we go with this? We have about actually officially only 10 minutes left.
Yeah. Do we want to drop into that and go off recording and allow some folks to?
What could probably happen, the rest of this is to look at these videos I have on the four kingdoms so people can get a little sense of how, generally these archetypes show up meaningfully in our lives. And I don't necessarily have to go through that because people can have access to this slide and do that. And so it may just be helpful if we do a little work with the observations that people have made. Does that sound like a good idea to people or not?
Yeah, I think that's a good, my sense is let's kind of get into the practice of it. And so I'm going to go off video now. Of course, I'll put in the chat box the access to Japa's slides. So if you all want to go back and look at those videos on Facebook, I'll put that also in the comment section. And if you have other kind of questions, feel free to include those. But at the moment, we're going to go off so we can do some of the practice. So thank you, Japa, and thanks to those that have joined us. If you're on Zoom, stick on, and we're going to do some practice of this.